Pursuity Wave. The official IPOT signature series. Available now at riseattireusa.com.
This is Sir Patrick Mack, and I approve this message.
In the United States, mark my word, you will have Weimar conditions and you'll have solutions to the Weimar conditions.
This Nietzscheism was later developed into fascism and then into Nazism and was used to foment World Wars I and II. That those who direct the overall conspiracy could use the differences in those two so-called ideologies to enable them to divide larger and larger members of the human race into opposing camps so that they could be armed and then brainwashed into fighting and destroying each other.
Majesty, I did not expect your
I'm
Majesty.
sure you didn't, Bateman Holweg. And who is this?
This is Dr. Helphunt, Majesty, our principal contact with the Bolshevik revolutionaries in Russia. We were discussing means
I am well aware of what you are discussing, Chancellor. I am not utterly without sources of information in my government.
I assure your Majesty there was nothing secret in our discussion. It is a matter of transporting certain revolutionaries in Switzerland across Germany into Russia, Majesty, with your Majesty's permission.
Did you really imagine, Doctor, that we would willingly give our permission for the encouragement of a Bolshevik revolution in Russia?
But I had been given to understand, Majesty.
We have no intention of building up a power which could one day destroy us.
The Bolsheviks want only peace, Majesty.
On whose terms?
That must be a matter for negotiation, Majesty.
Any peace treaty will not be signed on their terms. Of that you may be assured.
I am confident that they are aware of that, Your Majesty.
We shall drive a very hard bargain, Doctor. One that even the Bolsheviks, however much they may desire peace, will find hard to swallow. Our interests in the wheat fields, the oil fields of Eastern Europe are very ambitious.
Their first consideration, Majesty, is peace. Without peace, there can be no revolution. I think you will find them willing to listen to reason.
And these Bolsheviks in Switzerland, by all accounts, an assorted lot. Are they reliable?
As far as I'm concerned, there is only one man that matters. He has been planning this revolution for 30 years. He is bitterly opposed to the war, and he has the support of the Bolsheviks, who, in turn, have many supporters in the army and navy.
Do you think that he will agree to this suggestion?
He is in a difficult position. Open support from the German government could politically be extremely embarrassing for him. But on the other hand, he is determined to return to Russia by any means he can.
And secrecy is most important.
It is imperative, Chancellor.
And you, Dr. Elpant, what is your interest in this little plot?
I am a socialist, Your Majesty. I will be happy to have played any part in bringing about a socialist revolution in Russia.
A revolution which you hope will then spread all across Europe?
That, I fear, Majesty, is only a matter of time.
If the German military plight were not so serious, I would forbid any action of this kind.
And I have Your Majesty's permission to proceed.
With the greatest reluctance. I tell you, if this scheme of yours succeeds, Betmanholweg, it will become something which Germany one day will live to regret.
November 9th, 1918. The German Empire would come to an end. War, poverty, Spanish flu, blockades that led to shortages of gas, food, and electricity had reduced the once prosperous country to a nation of despair. After refusing to abdicate the throne, the hand of Kaiser Wilhelm II was forced, and he fled to the Netherlands for asylum, where he would die in 1941. What began as an attempt to assist Austria-Hungary from completely collapsing had become a disastrous world war and an eventual humiliating defeat for the people of Germany. Wilhelm was the eldest child of Crown Prince Frederick and Victoria, who was the eldest child of Britain's Queen Victoria. Wilhelm was third cousin to Russia's last Tsar, Nicholas II, and also related to King George of England, Queen Marie of Romania, Princess Margaret of Sweden, Queen Victoria Eugenia of Spain, and many more all across Europe. Wilhelm had suffered complications at birth in 1859 in Berlin, resulting in severe nerve damage to his left arm, leaving it paralyzed and requiring painful electroshock therapy. In 1881, Wilhelm married Princess Augusta Victoria of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg, who was also his second cousin, although Wilhelm had originally proposed to his first cousin, Princess Alex of Hesse, who had refused and married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia instead. She was executed along with Nicholas by Bolsheviks in 1918 in gruesome fashion. Augusta bore Wilhelm 6 sons and a daughter. The Bolshevik Revolution had toppled Tsarist Russia, and now Vladimir Lenin, who had been exiled to Switzerland, attempted to return to Russia. The UK and France would certainly not allow Lenin passage, but a Bolshevik deal with Germany would serve to be mutually beneficial. Germany was fighting a war on two fronts, and with the Russian exit in the east, Wilhelm's forces could concentrate on the Western Front. The Kaiser would permit Lenin passage through Germany on a sealed railway carriage with a number of Bolshevik supporters. It's believed that along with transportation, the Kaiser had also supplied Lenin with tens of millions of marks. Some of these receipts were published by Stern magazine in the 1990s. Others showed payments to a Swedish account of Lenin's from a German donor, as well as payments from the Reichsbank sent to Bolshevik Leon Trotsky. Lenin also needed peace, as anti-Bolshevik forces following the Bolshevik seizure of Petrograd were on the rise, and a possible civil war appeared imminent. The Eastern Front was a big source of agricultural support for troops, particularly in Ukraine, where Joseph Stalin would eventually starve millions of locals by stealing their crops and selling them abroad during the events of the Holodomor. On March 3, 1918, the Russian Bolshevik government and the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire ended Russia's role in the First World War. This treaty was signed at Brest-Litovsk in what is now modern-day Belarus. The head of the Soviet delegation was Adolf Abramovich Joffe, a Bolshevik revolutionary of Crimean Karaite Jewish heritage. Joffe was a Menshevik and assisted Leon Trotsky in editing his famed newspaper, Pravda. He had also been exiled, but to Siberia, until being allowed to return to Crimea. Years later, his support for Trotsky would lead to his own demise, as his health declined and the Stalinist regime would not send him overseas for treatment. After Trotsky was expelled from the Communist Party, Joffe committed suicide on the 16th of November, 1927. A note was left to Trotsky, but intercepted by the secret police. With you, my dear Leo Davidovich, I am connected by decades of common work, and I venture to hope, personal friendship. This gives me the right to tell you, in parting, what faults I find in you. I have never doubted that the way pointed out by you was the right way, and you know that I have been going the same way as you for more than 20 years, since the beginning of the permanent revolution. But I have always been of opinion that you lack the inflexibility and firmness of Lenin, that determination to stick to the path recognized as right, even if wholly isolated, trusting in a future majority and a future recognition of the entire rectitude of your way. Politically, you have always been right, ever since 1905, and I have repeatedly told you that I heard with my own ears how Lenin admitted that you, and not he, was right in 1905. In the face of death, men do not lie, and I repeat the same again. But you have often renounced your own truth in favor of an agreement, a compromise which you overestimated. That was a mistake. I repeat, politically, you were right. And now, more than ever, once the party will come to recognize this, and history will appreciate it as it deserves. Therefore, fear nothing if many turn from you at present, and still less so if there are not many that turn to you now as quickly as we all wished. You are in the right, but the guarantee of the victory of your truth lies in a great firmness, in strict adherence to the line of action, in the repudiation of all compromise, just as this was always the secret of the victory of Lenin. I have often wished to tell you this, but it is only now, in taking leave of you, that I could make up my mind to do so. Still, a few words of a personal character. I leave behind me a wife who is unused to independence, a small boy, and a sick daughter. I know you can do nothing for them at present, and from the present party leaders, I expect absolutely nothing in this regard. But I do not doubt that the moment is not so far distant when you will again resume this position in the party, which is yours by right. Do not then forget my wife and my children. I wish you no smaller degree of energy and courage than you have demonstrated up to the present, and a speedy victory. I embrace you. Farewell. With Russia out of the picture, Germany could now focus on the Western Front. But on April 6, 1917, the United States entered the war against Central Powers. Britain had been lobbying to U.S. President Woodrow Wilson for an intervention after becoming frustrated with the Bolsheviks. Russian Bolsheviks would eventually disband their ineffectual army to concentrate on their already tenuous revolution, taking with them much-needed war supplies that had been purchased on Allied credit by the Tsarist and Provisionist regimes. Allied forces were determined to reach stockpiles of material held in northern Russia along the Trans-Siberian Railway, such as Arkhangelsk and the port of Murmansk, where Bolsheviks were already removing supplies as quickly as possible. At the same time, Lenin had offered safe passage through Siberia to a legion of Czech and Slovak soldiers who had been fighting for their own independence from Austria-Hungary. This group was mostly comprised of volunteers, but as many of the 50,000 members traveled along the Trans-Siberian Rail to Vladivostok, only about half arrived at their final destination, as more fighting broke out along the way with Bolshevik forces. Another group of German forces was threatening to capture Murmansk and even possibly Arkhangelsk. This led Allied forces to push even harder for American military intervention to rescue the now endangered Czech Legion, stop the Germans and Bolsheviks from capturing the stockpiles, defeat the Bolsheviks, and prevent resurrection of the Eastern Front. In February of 1918, Edgar Chisson announced that he had evidence of Lenin taking funds from Germany. He took these documents to the United States soon after, which led to the withdrawal of all non-departmental personnel from Russia. Chisson was the Petrograd representative of the U.S. Committee on Public Information, or CPI. This was an agency independent from the government, under the Woodrow Wilson administration, created solely for the purpose of increasing public support for a U.S. role in the war, using every possible form of medium and propaganda. This committee was established by Wilson in 1917 through Executive Order No. 2594, creating the first official state propaganda bureau in the United States, only 7 days after the U.S. entered the war. According to George Creel, a former journalist with the Denver Post, propaganda should be the propagation of faith. We did not call it propaganda, for that word in German hands had come to be associated with deceit and corruption. Within months, the CPI had 75,000 volunteers distributing pamphlets, newspaper releases, advertisements, films, school outreaches, and more to over 300 million listeners. Supporting the Red Cross and buying Liberty bonds were encouraged, as well as promoting draft registration and hiring unskilled labor for munitions jobs. Creel later revealed in his memoirs that the CPI often would deny the atrocities occurring on the battlefield in order to promote a more optimistic and patriotic sentiment. According to a 1940 report from the Council on Foreign Relations, this committee created the most efficient engine of war propaganda which the world had ever seen. The CPI had its own news and film divisions and enlisted artists such as James Montgomery Flagg, Joseph Pennell, Louis Fancher, and N.C. Wyeth. But public skepticism arose after an incident when the CPI provided major newspapers a story about the Navy's 1st Division sinking German submarines, a story that turned out to be untrue. After public cries for an investigation, the New York Times called the CPI the Committee on Public Misinformation. Once again, in 1918, the CPI announced that American-built battle planes were on their way to France, when in fact the pictures provided were fake, and at the time only one plane was even available, and still in testing. The CPI's influence was deep enough to control most of media and print, and would often be the subject of congressional hearings. As for the Petrograd representative Edgar Chisson, his documents that purported to prove that Lenin, Trotsky, and other Bolshevik revolutionaries were not only being paid by the German government, but agents of the government itself. These documents, simply known as the Chisson documents, were rushed in secrecy to Washington, D.C., where they were submitted for authentication to the National Board for Historical Service. These documents were organized into 3 groups, the first being declared as authentic, the second, copies, and no confident declaration on the third group. Under George Creel, the CPI published the Sisson documents, which the American press largely accepted as authentic, apart from the New York Evening Post, owned by Thomas W. Lamont, a J.P. Morgan partner and member of the banking organization Bankers Trust, now a part of the State Street Corporation. Representative of the Paris Peace Conference, which would later determine Germany's reparations following the First World War, Lamont had partnered with the Red Cross, who just a few years before had denied Ukrainian refugees with food and medical supplies sent from Germany to Ukraine during the Bolshevik Revolution. The two forces attempted, unsuccessfully, to encourage U.S. aid to the Bolsheviks to keep Russia in the war. The aid that the Red Cross denied to Ukraine led to millions of deaths in Europe during the Holodomor. In June of 1919, the CPI was publicly disestablished, but a new council, a Council on Foreign Relations, would take its place in 1921, with Lamont as a member. He was also a member of the infamous Jekyll Island Club, where the Federal Reserve System would be created. He was instrumental as head of J.P. Morgan for maintaining a preferential stock list for liquidation of stocks on the Black Thursday crash of 1929, 1 week after assuring President Hoover that the future appears brilliant. During the 1920s, an exhaustive study of the Sisson documents by American diplomat George Kennan revealed nearly all to be forgeries, many of them carelessly made, apart from a few original documents, although much of the information appeared to be authentic. The documents themselves did not. The papers had come to Edgar Sisson from Alexander Gumberg, whose real name was Mikhail Grusenberg. He often went by the name Borodin, a Jewish Bolshevik revolutionary and member of the Jewish Labor Bund. He was arrested by Tsarist police in St. Petersburg and offered exile in either Siberia or Europe. After a brief time in London, he moved to the USA, first Boston, then Chicago, and later attending Valparaiso University in Indiana. Grusenberg even taught at the famously haunted Chicago Socialist Institution, Jane Addams Hall House, co-founded with the socialist activist Ellen Gates Starr. The Hull House pushed for a mixed racial community and often held theater plays featuring ancient Greek performances in Greek, eventually leading to the development of the off-loop theater scene. After the Bolshevik Revolution, Grusenberg returned to Russia and joined Comintern, otherwise known as the Third International, or Communist International, which advocated for worldwide communism. The movement was pushing eastward towards India and China, who had experienced their own revolution back in 1911, the Xinhai Revolution, which led to the establishment of the Republic of China. As a representative of this group, Lenin sent Grusenberg to work with Sun Yat-sen and his Kuomintang, or Nationalist Revolutionary Army. Grusenberg himself had been involved with the Northern Expedition, a military campaign initiated by the Kuomintang against the Beiyang government, eventually leading to two-party factions, the right-leaning Nanjing, led by Chiang Kai-shek, while Grusenberg lent his assistance to the leftist revolutionaries, led by Sun Yat-sen, in creating the Hankow government, also known as the Wuhan government. Grusenberg used his influence to unite the Communist Party of China under Lenin's ideology and mass education groups, such as the Peasants' Training Institute, that would soon produce a young revolutionary by the name of Mao Zedong. The actions of Michael Grusenberg led to what is known as the Arcos Affair, referring to the All-Russian Cooperative Society, dealing with Anglo-Soviet trade. Arcos established their own bank and separate legal entity from the trading company. British MI5 suspected Arcos to be a front organization dealing in espionage. On the 12th of May 1927, a raid on the Russia House took place. The investigation led to the discovery of a hidden cipher room and numerous documents. The Soviet embassy claimed the raid was illegal, and British PM Stanley Baldwin responded by reading aloud a set of telegrams which were to prove that Borodin, or Michael Grusenberg, was guilty of espionage. The Jewish American journalist Louis Fisher, who had previously lied to the American people about the atrocities in Ukraine, as explained in Episode 3, would have this to say about the Arcos affair. It disclosed nothing that had not been known before, and failed to produce the highly important War Office documents, the rumored theft of which served as excuse for the raid. The official white paper containing the documents found in the raid was thin evidence indeed, and led to no arrests or changes for illegal or subversive activities by Russian or British subjects. Arcos did nearly 100 million pounds of trade between Britain and the Soviet Union in only 6 years. Despite the validity of the Sisson documents, public perception of Germany as a sole scapegoat would allow the Americans to enter the war with little scrutiny for their collaboration with the Bolsheviks, while also helping to defeat the Germans. What had occurred in Russia just a year before was already spreading into Germany. Germany had been well on their way to winning the war, and yet now, with the Americans' participation, fortunes were about to change. German forces were now losing manpower, and German Social Democrats were sowing discord, defeatism, and mutiny, led by Rosalia, or Rosa, Luxemburg, a Polish-German Jewish revolutionary. Rosa was a Marxist, a member of the Communist Party in Germany, and one of the founders of the Marxist revolutionary Spartacus League. Her grandfather Abraham was a key figure amongst the Maskilim, or activists during the Jewish Enlightenment, or Haskalah, promoting liberalism and a secular view towards Orthodox Judaism, based on Torah. Maskilim allowed for mixed-gender seating during services, and removed the traditional prayers, which spoke of Israel's desire to return to Israel, or the arrival of a coming Mashiach, or Messiah. In its place, science and secular studies. Luxemburg believed that the most important method to achieving socialism was the mass strike of the worker. By radicalizing everyday workers, the revolution can push forward. While the Social Democrats backed German efforts, Luxemburg did not. Along with Karl Liebknecht, Clara Zetkin, and Franz Mehring, Luxemburg formed the Spartacusbund, or the Spartacus League, which later became the Communist Party of Germany. Like the Bolsheviks, Luxemburg wanted political power for the workers and soldiers. On September 30, 1918, Georg von Hertling resigned as German Chancellor and was replaced by Prince Maximilian of Baden. Baden exchanged numerous letters with U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, who insisted that Allied forces would not negotiate with Germany until Kaiser Wilhelm abdicated the throne. Earlier that year, Wilson had released a series of statements regarding conditions for peace negotiations to end the war, including the restoration of Belgium, adjusted borders in Italy, and the establishment of an independent Polish state, where Luxembourg was from. These points laid the groundwork later on for the establishment of the League of Nations. The 14 points were drafted by Jewish-American writer and Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter and member of the Socialist Party, Walter Lippmann. Lippmann believed that the mass media culture was an effective tool for creating a propaganda machine in order to preserve democracy, and coined the phrase Great Society. Along with Lippmann, Mennonite and Johns Hopkins University President Isaiah Bowman, philosopher Sidney Meses, and lawyer David Hunter Miller, who also helped draft the covenant of the League of Nations. In many ways, the 14 points called for an abolition of colonialism, which created resentment from the British and French empires and implanted more hope for independence amongst many citizens, fueling the fire for revolutionaries. A reference to ethnic minorities having a right to self-governance appeared to be an endorsement of the previous year's Balfour Declaration, establishing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, an Ottoman region at the time. Delivered to banker Lionel Walter Rothschild, eldest son of Nathan Rothschild, the same bankers financing the war. The document was first drafted by Rothschild in 1917 and later edited by Arthur James Balfour, 1st Earl of Balfour, lawyer and Prime Minister of the UK, and later by Alfred Milner, a member of London's Inner Temple. This declaration constituted as the first step towards political Zionism, but its legitimacy has long been in question. On its face, it would appear that the Balfour Declaration was a unilateral expression of intent. The letter was written on behalf of His Majesty's government, approved by a British cabinet, signed by a British foreign secretary. And yet for the British to claim territory that had yet to be taken in war while still fighting with the Allied forces of France, Russia, Italy, and later the USA would be illogical and suspect, seeing as other nations too had eyes on Palestine. This action is largely remembered as a British imperial act, but this was more likely a carefully constructed strategy organized by multiple nations. The British accepted Zionism largely as a patron of the Jews, but also in order to benefit from the anticipated breakup of the Middle East, and claimed to champion the Jewish people, while keeping Palestine from the French. The Balfour Declaration is largely attributed to Russian Jewish-born Chaim Weizmann, famed biochemist and later first president of the State of Israel. Weizmann was from Belarus, then a part of the Russian Empire. 10 of his 15 siblings made Aliyah, the immigration to the geographical land of Israel. His brother Shmuel Weizmann was a communist and anti-Zionist, arrested by the Stalinist regime and executed in 1939. Like Chaim, most of his siblings were doctors or chemists. Sister Maria, arrested in 1952 during the Doctors' Plot, where a group of predominantly Jewish doctors were arrested in suspicion of conspiracy to assassinate Soviet leaders. Mina Weizmann was lover of German spy Kurt Prüfer and worked as a German spy as well in Cairo, then a British protectorate. She was later outed and deported, but was given passage through Russia by consul of the Russian Tsar. She survived the war and later worked for the Hadassah Medical Center, a Jewish women's Zionist organization that promotes abortion. Chaim is credited for the discovery of synthetic acetone by fermentation of bacteria. Acetone was later used in the manufacturing of cordite explosive propellants used by Allied forces. In 1910, Winston Churchill signed papers for Weizmann to become a British citizen until he renounced it to become president of Israel. Chaim would find his funding through influential resources such as Dorothy de Rothschild, who was married to James de Rothschild. But it was Charles, second son of Nathan Meyer Rothschild, that was intrigued by this concept, as well as Robert Cecil, one of the architects of the League of Nations and Nobel Peace Prize winner. Weizmann found additional financial support from Israel Seif and Simon Marks, chairman of the clothing retailer Marks & Spencer. But perhaps one of his most valuable allies was journalist and editor C.P. Scott of the Manchester Guardian. He would turn Weizmann towards Herbert Samuel, a liberal and the first Jew to serve as cabinet minister, and eventually a Zionist, appointed as first High Commissioner to Palestine. Weizmann moved the English Zionist Federation office to the Rothschild neighborhood of Piccadilly, helping Weizmann become part of London's inner circle. Alfred Milner's Quarterly Review gave voice to Weizmann's Zionist ideas, helping to shape the British political landscape. British Zionist Harry Sacker wrote of the Jewish international influence, which even then was being referred to as legend. That legend finds its crudest and its stupidest expression in the protocols of the elders of Zion. But many even of those who reject a forgery and a lie have a residual belief in the power and the unity of Jewry. We suffer for it, but it is not wholly without its compensations. It is one of the imponderabilia of politics, and it plays, consciously or unconsciously, its part in the calculations and the decisions of statesmen. A lesser-known figure involved in the Balfour Declaration is Nahum Sokolow, who bears the namesake for Beit Sokolow, the headquarters for the Israeli Journalists Association in Tel Aviv. Born in central Poland and raised in traditional rabbinic schooling, Sokolow was a polyglot and prodigy, who later became editor of the Hebrew journal Hatzevera. Like Weizmann, Sokolow was a follower, and in Weizmann's case, sometimes rival, of Theodor Herzl and his novel Alt Neuland, which had spread rapidly amongst the Jewish international community. It was Sokolow who translated Alt Neuland into Hebrew. As a journalist, Sokolow was better known than Weizmann, which is why the Jewish community regards Sokolow as slightly more influential, but Sokolow was well known for securing approval of a Jewish national home from not only the French and Italian governments, but also from the Pope. At the time, the ownership of the land of the Ottoman Empire had been settled through the Sykes-Picot Agreement, a secret treaty between the United Kingdom and France, named for Sir Mark Sykes representing the British and François-Georges Picot for the French, an agreement that Prime Minister Lloyd George viewed as far too favorable for the French. On February 7, 1917, at a private residence, a quiet meeting took place between Sykes, Sokolov, Weizmann, Lord Walter Rothschild, James de Rothschild, and Herbert Samuel. Britain was willing to grant Zionists recognition, but the French wanted access to Syria and much of Palestine. It was Sokolov who had taken on the task, with not only Picot, but the French, over the Zionist project, and he would get just that on June 4, 1917, when Secretary General of the Foreign Ministry, Jules Cambon, issued a letter clearing the path for the Balfour Declaration. This was a big victory for Jewry, but also for the Catholics, who claimed rights to holy sites in Palestine as well, and at the time had maintained the view that the Jews were scattered because of God's punishment and refusal to accept Jesus. This was no small victory for Sokolov. Another crucial element existed in Washington, D.C., with President Woodrow Wilson. Sokolov recruited Louis D. Brandeis, American lawyer and associate justice to the Supreme Court. Sokolov wrote of the negotiations. The negotiations in political circles in England and France were known in America. Every success was welcomed there with enthusiasm and often also received further support. American policy was generally hostile to Zionism, but upon second request, President Woodrow Wilson had a change of heart. In a letter to Foreign Affairs Advisor Colonel Edward House, "I find in my pocket the memorandum you gave me about the Zionist movement. I am afraid I did not say to you that I concurred in the formula suggested by the other side. I do, and would be obliged if you would let them know it." Even the Secretary of State was unaware. With the consent of America, Zionists could now be able to obtain a British declaration. Weizmann, Sokolov, and Brandeis could claim their victory. The previous secret agreement with the British and King Hussein of Mecca, known as the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence, was now irrelevant. This agreement supported Arab independence in parts of Syria, Mesopotamia, and even Palestine. But this secret agreement allowed officials to deny of its knowledge, and the Balfour Declaration would be declared and endorsed around the world. Sokolov later joked of the Balfour Declaration at a dinner in November of 1917, saying that the declaration had been sent to the Lord and not to the Jewish people because they had no address, whereas the Lord had a very fine one. President Wilson explicitly asked for his approval of the Balfour Declaration not to be made public. The United States never entered the League of Nations and never ratified the mandate. In June of 1922, the Lodge-Fish Resolution would reproduce the text of the Declaration. October 24, 1918, German Admiral Reinhard Scheer orders his already demoralized fleet to attack the British Royal Navy. Sailors at Kiel mutinied and rioted. Germans were already beginning to see the writing on the wall, losing the war of attrition, and with U.S. forces arriving with more ammunition and supplies, defeat appeared imminent. 3 ships in the Third Navy refused to raise anchor. Sailors on the SMS Thuringen and the SMS Helgoland mutinied. By October 30th, many mutineers surrendered, and over 1,000 arrested. These sailors were brought back to Kiel, where more soldiers began to protest at the base. Dock workers joined in, and on November 1st, made demand for the sailors to be set free. By the next day, protests reached the hundreds, and the next day on the 3rd, it was in the thousands. By the 4th, the base was under control of the sailors. Freedom and bread was the rally cry. The protesters at Kiel made a list of demands known as the Kiel 14 Points, fashioned after Woodrow Wilson's statements. Delegations were sent to every major city in Germany. The German Revolution was now gaining momentum. By November 9th, Kaiser Wilhelm abdicated his throne. Canadian naval officer and naval control officer for the St. Lawrence, Commander William Guy Carr, gives a different account of the mutiny at Kiel. The armistice was signed as a prelude to a negotiated peace. It is of the utmost importance to remember this fact, because an armistice entered into under those conditions is far different from unconditional surrender. The events which caused the German High Command to realize their danger on the home front were as follows. Rosa Luxemburg's revolutionaries infiltrated into the German High Seas Fleet. They became very active in 1918. They spread rumors that the ships and their crews were to be sacrificed in an all-out battle with the combined British and American navies. The rumor mongers stated that the purpose of the battle was to cripple the combined Allied fleets to such an extent they would be unable to defend the British coast against a military invasion, planned to bring the German warlords victory. The communist cells exhorted the German seamen to mutiny because they claimed that the planned invasion of Britain was doomed to failure due to the fact that the British scientists had developed a secret weapon. According to the rumor mongers, invading craft could, by the use of chemicals fired from guns ashore or dropped from planes, be surrounded by a sea of flames. Fire, heat, and lack of oxygen would create conditions in which nothing human could survive. The subversives argued that the only way to avoid such a fate was to bring about a revolution to end the war. The German seamen mutinied the 3rd of November 1918. Much of this defeatism lasted until the abdication of the Kaiser. An armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, Paris time, in Compiègne, France. Luxembourg's funding came from a familiar source, the same as that of Lenin and Trotsky, the Jewish international banking system, this time through a fund made available by Soviet Ambassador Adolf Joff. The idea, according to Commander Carr, was to keep the Germans fighting one more world war before Sovietizing them. A second world war to exhaust world powers, only to allow Soviet Russia, under Lenin, to claim the supplies and resources to spread through Europe. June 28, 1919, the Treaty of Versailles brought the First World War to an end, resulting in devastating losses for what could have otherwise been a victorious Germany. The War Guilt Clause, or Article 231, featured in the treaty, called for reparations to countries of the Entente. Germany would be disarmed and make staggering concessions that would take years to recover from. Roughly 132 billion gold marks, or nearly $32 billion, equivalent to around $442 billion in modern times. This unsurprisingly resulted in a rise of capitalism and animosity towards Jews, who many felt were responsible for the German defeat. Of those Jews were Rosa Luxemburg and partner Karl Liebknecht, who were captured and shot. Lenin would consolidate his power and begin preparing in defense for an upcoming capitalist act of aggression, a point which Trotsky disagreed on. He wanted to push the revolution outward. But Lenin only approved of anything within the 35th and 45th parallel of latitude in the Northern Hemisphere. This would concentrate focus upon Italy, Spain, Greece, and Asia Minor, including Palestine and parts of China, as well as the border of Canada and the United States. These governments were given instruction to prepare their parties and to take power if and when outside revolutionary forces were prepared to invade and cause revolution. This defense became known as the Musk-Ox Plan. Spain became the next country of focus, and in Germany, a Hungarian Jewish communist named Karl Radek would pick up where Luxembourg left off. Karl had been arrested in 1907 in Poland and later moved to Germany. In 1910, he was accused of stealing books, clothes, and money from his fellow comrades in the Polish Socialist Party. He moved again, this time near Stuttgart, where he was put in charge of the local paper. Radek was one of the revolutionaries aboard the train that carried Lenin through Germany and took part in the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. He later became secretary of the Comintern, or Third International. Moses led the Jews out of Egypt, and Stalin from the Politburo. Radek was later arrested for taking part in an anti-Soviet Trotskyite scheme. He allegedly died from hitting his head on the floor when a man tried to strangle him. An investigation lasted well into the 1950s, suggesting heavy KGB involvement. The alleged killer was released in November of 1939, with the official wording being, "for completing special tasks." The idea of acquiring Palestine was not just about establishing a home for the Jews. It was about resources, vast deposits of minerals around the Dead Sea. Israel could serve as a proxy under the guise of a sovereign state to control a second and third world war and to harness the power of nearly $3 trillion of mineral wealth. Field Marshal Edmund Henry Hyman Allenby, who led the British Empire's Egyptian Expeditionary Force into Sinai and Palestine, was unaware at the time that Palestine would eventually be turned over to the Jews. During this time, the Zionist Commission was created as liaison between the Jews and the military to do the bidding of the bankers. Members included Major Ormsby Gore, director of the Midland Bank, the Standard of South Africa, and the Union Corporation; James de Rothschild, son of Edmund Rothschild of Paris, who had previously owned colonies in Palestine; Lieutenant Edwin Samuel, chief censor of the British government and later chief director of Palestine Broadcasting after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948; Leon Simon, British Zionist, chairman of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, president of the Israel Postal Company Bank. The only remaining handwritten draft of the Balfour Declaration was written by Simon and auctioned for $884,000 through Sotheby's in New York. Simon controlled much of the cable and telephone facilities. Also in attendance, chairman of clothing manufacturer Marks & Spencer, Israel Seif. He was chairman of the Political and Economic Planning Committee and advised multiple British governments. His influence and service to the Jewish international banking structure earned him the title of Commander of the Order of Maccabees, a Jewish Freemasonic Zionist order, referring to the priestly family of Jews who rebelled against Antiochus IV and reconstructed the Temple of Jerusalem. The influence of these bankers at the Zionist Commission would result in the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Banker Paul Warburg led the American delegation, his brother Max, the German delegation. British journalist for the Daily Telegraph, Emile Joseph Dillon, said of the event, "The sequence of expedients framed and enforced in this direction were inspired by the Jews assembled in Paris for the purpose of realizing their carefully thought-out programs, which they succeeded in having substantially executed." Negotiating the treaty for France was Georges Clemenceau, owner of the left-wing publication La Rolle. Serving as his secretary, Georges Mandel, a Jew from Alsace, who in 1894 had fiercely defended Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish-French officer convicted of communicating military secrets to the German embassy. Mandel's real name was Louis George Rothschild, but he changed it, seeing it as not only too Jewish, but too Rothschild. After his work on the Treaty of Versailles, he rose through the ranks of the Third Republic and was elected to the French Parliament, became an early detractor of Adolf Hitler, and later went to North Africa to escape German forces, arrested in Morocco, and returned to France for refusing to suspend constitutional law and give power to the government of Marshal Pétain, Marshal of France after the war. He was later captured by the Vichy government and executed. Jewish-English journalist and co-founder of the League of British Jews, Lucian Wolff, who opposed Zionism and the Balfour Declaration, says this on page 408 of his Essays in Jewish History. A small group of other distinguished Jews appear as signatories of the peace treaty. The Treaty of Versailles is signed for France by Louis Clotz. He was afterwards implicated in shady financial transactions and retired from public life. Baron Samino for Italy and Edwin Montagu for India. The League of British Jews had been founded a few years before, in 1917. By banker Lionel Nathan de Rothschild, educator, politician, and former rabbi Philip Magnus, and liberal politician Samuel Montagu, Orthodox Jew and son of Louis Samuel, a clockmaker. Montagu later founded merchant bank Montagu & Company, which is now a part of the private banking service of HSBC, and its equity business, a division of Midland Bank. Wolff wanted to use the public American opinion of Jews and Zionism to advocate for the entrance of the U.S. into the First World War. But despite Wolff's feelings about Zionism, in particular rejecting the notion that the Jews constitute a separate political nationality. Chaim Weizmann and James de Rothschild, who met with Wolf, would press on. As the top official at the Joint Foreign Committee of the Anglo-Jewish Association, Wolf was essentially the foreign minister for the organized Jewish community. After the Versailles Conference in Paris, Wolf drafted the minorities treaties for Jews in Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Greece, and Yugoslavia. He also briefly chaired the League of Nations Committee on Refugees. By the spring of 1919, revolution would also hit Hungary, with communist Bela Kun, whose real name was Aaron Cohen, assuming power. Son of a Jewish village notary in Transylvania, his mother was a converted Protestant. Kun was a journalist who fought for the Bolsheviks and later returned to Hungary with support of the Soviets. He co-founded a Hungarian wing of the Russian Communist Party. Before the First World War, Kun had been accused of embezzling funds from the Kolozsvár Social Insurance Board on which he served. In 1918, Austria-Hungary had collapsed. Prime Minister Sándor Wekerle resigned, and the appointment of Count Mihály Károlyi as new prime minister would not be recognized by King Charles IV. During the war, millions had died in Romania and Russia. 10% of the Austria-Hungarian army taken prisoner. Bela Kun had been one of them. He had become a Bolshevik as he watched Russian Tsarism fall. He expressed his desire to work with them. Although I worked for the common cause far from the Russian comrades, I too absorbed the air of the West, where the great ideas of social democracy were born. Now, in the light of the Great Russian Revolution, I understand. Exordiens de Lux. After the October Revolution, Kun was transferred from Tomsk to Petrograd, working at the International Propaganda Department of Foreign Affairs under his director, Karl Radek. Both would serve as agitators during the negotiations at Brest-Litovsk. Kun helped to recruit nearly 100,000 Hungarians for the Soviets. He, Tibor Samueli, and Andrei Rudniansky prepared to foment revolution throughout Hungary. Lectures and seminars were held across the region. Many of these prisoners would return to Hungary by late 1918. The German offensive had failed, Allied forces advancing. The Austrian Habsburg dynasty, like the rest of the imperial dynasties, were in disarray or collapsed. As more soldiers began to mutiny, the last of the Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty, Emperor Charles I, or Karl, who had attempted to secretly negotiate an exit to the war, was now dethroned and exiled to Switzerland. The obvious choice to lead the republic? Count Mihály Károlyi, a Roman Catholic aristocrat who was born from a cousin's marriage, resulting in a cleft lip and palate. Along with Oskar Jászai, the Social Democrat Party would become the new government. In response, Charles appointed Count János Hedik as prime minister, but Hedik resigned the next day. Károlyi would become PM. The white chrysanthemum, which was popular during the celebration of All Saints' Day, became the symbol of the revolution. Károlyi's aster, or chrysanthemum revolution, led to the founding of the first, albeit short-lived, Hungarian People's Republic. The aster flower in a hat symbolized support for the Social Democrats' Hungarian National Council. This council demanded the separation of Hungary from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Prime Minister Sándor Wekerle had resigned, and former Prime Minister István Tisza had been killed. This led to King Charles IV stepping down and accepting the Károlyi regime. Károlyi immediately terminated the Compromise of 1867 and formally dissolved the Austro-Hungarian Union. Jewish Austrian neurologist Sigmund Freud had this to say about Károlyi and Tisza's death. I was certainly no adherent of the ancient regime, but it seems doubtful to me whether it is a sign of political shrewdness to beat to death the smartest of many counts and to make the stupidest one president. The murder of Tisza represented the death of the old system, likely orchestrated by Bela Kun. Károlyi adhered to Wilson's 14 points and ordered the disarmament of the Hungarian army. Nearly 75% of its territory held before World War I was now at risk.
Товарищ Бела Кун хорошо знаком был мне еще тогда, когда он был военнопленным в России и не раз приходил ко мне беседовать на темы о коммунизме и коммунистической революции. Поэтому, когда пришло сообщение о венгерской коммунистической революции, и при том сообщение, подписанное товарищем Белокун, нам захотелось поговорить с ним и выяснить точнее, как обстояло дело с этой революцией. Первые сообщения о ней заставляли несколько опасаться, не было ли обмана со стороны так называемых социалистов или социал-предателей. Не, обошли ли они коммунистов, тем более все сидели в тюрьме. И вот на другой день после первого сообщения о венгерской революции я послал радиотелеграмму в Будапешт, прося Белокун прийти к аппарату, задавая ему вопросы такого рода, чтобы проверить, он ли сам присутствует, спрашивая его, какие реальные гарантии имеются относительно характера правительства, его действительной политики. Ответ, который дал товарищ Белокун, был вполне удовлетворительный и рассеял все наши сомнения. Оказалось, что в тюрьму к Белокун пришли совещаться об образовании правительства левые социалисты. И только эти левые социалисты, сочувствовавшие коммунистам, да еще люди центра, образовали новое правительство. А правые социалисты, социал-предатели, так сказать, непримиримые и неисправимые, совсем ушли из партии и ушли, не взяв с собой никого из рабочих. Дальнейшие сообщения показали, что политика венгерского правительства была самая твердая в коммунистическом направлении. Настолько, что если мы начали с рабочего контроля и лишь постепенно переходили к социализации промышленности, то Белокун своим авторитетом, своей уверенностью в том, что за него стоят громадные массы, мог сразу провести закон о переходе в общественную собственность тех промышленных предприятий в Венгрии, которые вели к капиталистизму. 2 дня прошло, и мы вполне убедились в том, что венгерская революция сразу, необыкновенно быстро стала на коммунистические рельсы. Буржуазия сама отдала власть коммунистам Венгрии. Буржуазии показалось всему миру, что когда наступает тяжелый кризис, когда нация в опасности, буржуазия управлять не может, и есть только одна действительно народная, действительно любимая народом власть, власть советов рабочих, солдатских и крестьянских депутатов. Да здравствует советская власть в Венгрии!
March 1919. A communist putsch would help to establish the Hungarian Soviet Republic, with Karol Yi resigning and Kuhn assuming power. What followed would be 133 days of pure terror, known as the Red Terror. Jails were opened, prisoners released, courts of law suspended. In its place, revolutionary tribunals, which could decide life or death. Private homes and weapons seized, banks put under government control, while foreign currency was sent overseas for propaganda campaigns. We must inspire the revolution with the blood of the bourgeois exploiters. All teaching of patriotism was banned, religion denied or abused. Kuhn's henchman, Hungarian Soviet Commissar of Agriculture, Tibor Samueli, traveled the countryside in a bright red train from which tortured peasants would often be thrown from. Samueli was a Hungarian Jew who became a journalist and fought in the World War. He also participated in the Spartacus Bund with Rosa Luxemburg. Now he was creating a trail of blood, hanging 24 people without even a trial, and shooting dead a young schoolboy who had commented that these people are wild beasts, not men. Along with him, Josef Schwartz, who changed his name to Joseph Pogany, and later John Pepper to disguise his Jewish heritage, a ruthless communist whose soldiers took their places amongst the ranks of the police force, intimidating agitators. This paramilitary group was simply known as Lenin's Boys. Now the power is in our hands. Anyone who wants the return of the old capitalist rule must be hanged mercilessly. The throat of such a man must be bitten out. The victory of the proletariat in Hungary so far has not cost much in human sacrifice, but now it will be necessary to shed blood. Don't be afraid of the bloodshed. Blood is steel. It strengthens our heart. It strengthens the fist of the proletariat. It is blood what will lead us to the true greatness. If it is necessary, we will destroy the whole bourgeoisie. Otto Corvin Klein, head of the commercial department of the Socialist Production Committee, was the one who nationalized private shops and sentenced numerous innocent people to death. It was the hope of Kuhn and Samueli to train troops for revolution in a return to Hungary, where Lenin had supposedly pledged his eventual support. Hungary was in turmoil, and the French, Romanian, and Yugoslav armies continued to threaten borders to the south and the east. One of the early members of the Hungarian Communist Party, George Lukács, born György Bernat Lovinger to the wealthy Jewish baron and investment banker Joseph Lovinger, became arguably its most well-known. Known as one of the founders of Western Marxism, Lovinger was a critic of Bolshevik methods, but after reading Lenin's State and Revolution, Lovinger's criticism turned more to praise. We communists are like Judas. It is our bloody work to crucify Christ. But this sinful work is at the same time our calling. Only through death on the cross does Christ become God, and this is necessary to be able to save the world. We communists then take the sins of the world upon us, in order to be able thereby to save the world. It's around this time Lovinger met Bela Kun and joined the Communist Party as its 52nd member. Nearly all of Kun's regime were of Jewish heritage, like the Bolsheviks, dedicating to spreading revolution worldwide. Media, journalism, and propaganda was their vehicle. There was hardly a worker who was not at some time and in some way exposed to communist propaganda. By focusing on miners, steel workers, and other unionized workers, homeless and unemployed, the party grew to 10,000 members in Budapest alone. Miners began to protest and occupy coal mines throughout Hungary, resulting in violence, and some strike leaders being shot. Soldiers also protested, followed by the jobless. The Hungarian Communist Party appeared to be the relief to the ineffectual Károlyi government. In the countryside, peasants were organizing militias to protect from land seizure, and in February of 1918, a communist demonstration outside the editorial building of the Social Democrat newspaper, Népszava, or the Voice of the People, led to violence, killing several police officers. That same night, the police responded by arresting 43 communist leaders and agitators, including Kun, who was severely beaten by police. Dozens of communists would be arrested in the following weeks. The next day, a mass protest was held by the socialists, over 250,000 people, to support the government. That is, until the news spread of Kun's beating, which would upstage the fallen officers' deaths. What had started out as an anti-communism protest became a somber event, leading to the protesters sympathizing with the communists, a reminder of the old regime. On Károlyi's request, around 50 of the arrested defendants, including Kun, were granted the status of political prisoner, allowing Kun and his staff to operate the Communist Party from inside prison. Kun's treatment was heralded as a type of martyrdom, and the Communist Party rolled on. March 20, 1919, Lieutenant Colonel Vix delivered an ultimatum demanding that Hungary relinquish vast amounts of land to Romania and to withdraw their forces, a telling sign that the Károlyi regime had failed. Károlyi had no choice but to resign. Kun demanded that the two parties create the new Soviet government. Kun was released from prison and now in charge. The Bolshevik Revolution had officially hit Hungary. This new government operated through the Revolutionary Governing Council. 28 of the commissars were of Jewish heritage, but curiously, none of them practicing Jews, which led to the idea once again that the Jews had conspired, just as the Bolsheviks did, to gain power. 9 of the 21 deputy commissars were communists, including Lukács and Samueli, but the real power rested with Bela Kun. Journalists, philosophers, revolutionaries would now assume roles in government with little to no experience. The Soviet government nationalized apartment housing, much to the dismay of middle-class landlords. More than 100,000 homeless workers given shelter, in many cases, rent canceled, unemployment benefits, paid maternity leave, free medical care, and higher wages, all leading to inflation. The so-called defenders of the working class nearly decimated the middle class. On March 31st, a new constitution was drafted, making it only the second socialist constitution in the world, styled after the one in Russia. Hungary was now a dictatorship, with the intent to federate with other Soviet republics. On March 23rd, Lenin sent a telegram to Kuhn, demanding assurance that the new republic was indeed communist. Please inform us of what real guarantees you have that the new Hungarian government will actually be a communist and not simply a socialist government, that is to say, one traitor socialist. Kuhn assured Lenin that he personally saw to it that the dictatorship of the proletariat had been created. But Lenin's trepidation would prove to be valid, as the socialists proved to be more experienced and organized, and began to dominate the operations apparatus of the party. It took the Hungarian SDP just 7 days to fully absorb the CP's secretariat, agitprop apparatus, and network of clandestine factory cells. If anything, Bolshevik norms did not prevail in the governing party of Soviet Hungary. A left opposition of communists such as Revai and Samueli condemned the fusion as immoral and spelling the doom of the Soviet Republic. With the unified party, Kuhn and his supporters found themselves in a minority amongst nearly 1.5 million Social Democrats, even more than existed before the war. With the decline of unemployment organizations and growth of new labor unions, the communists were losing hold on the unified party. Kuhn removed the distinction between deputy and full commissars in an effort to increase the number of communist commissars, and also excluded leftists from key positions of power, which only served to alienate Kuhn further from the party. But the nail in the coffin for Soviet Hungary was their urban-centered approach. Much of the population were peasants, whose desire for land far outweighed support for any political party. Kuhn, like Luxemburg, felt that the Russian Bolshevik approach of conceding land to the peasantry was unnecessary and petty. The Soviet Republic wanted to nationalize the land. The effort towards a socialist agricultural system would take time to implement, and co-op farms would have to be established in the meantime, which led to further resentment amongst the peasantry, who already disregarded many of the urban communist administrators as servants of the bourgeois Jews. The peasants would often destroy their own desperately needed food supply rather than provide for the Red Guard. The peasantry had long been wary of the godless urban structure and atheistic communism. The Catholic Church was often mocked. Under Kuhn, the clergy had been suffraged. The slaughter of the Red Terror was not lost on them, and their disdain for the Jew at fever pitch. Landlords, military officers, and clergymen became leaders of a counter-revolution against the encroaching Judeo-Bolshevik forces. Kuhn had been responsible for the execution of nearly 50,000 White Russian prisoners and civilians. When Kuhn later took charge of Crimea, another 70,000 tortured, killed, or deported. A fact that would not be forgotten, despite the lack of media ever acknowledging it to this day. Yet in that day, it was Lukács who was in charge of the media. As the People's Commissar for Education and Culture, he strived for nothing less than a cultural revolution, arguing that art was no longer just for the rich, but for all people. Sex education was introduced in primary schools with the goal of tearing apart the traditional family values. Lukács created a policy of what he called cultural terrorism. This called for targeting children's minds by means of lectures that encouraged against traditional values and rejected Christianity. Depravity and graphic sexual content was shown to the children, which outraged parents. The movie industry became nationalized and made affordable. A push for literacy, plays, art, and music became the priority, all part of a cultural revolution, encouraged by the state with healthy amounts of propaganda newsreels for accompaniment. Teachers would now be instructed to teach Marxism and Engels, and schooling was removed from the church and transferred to the state. Artists and intellectuals around the world were attracted to what appeared to be a newfound freedom of expression through revolution. A national trade union for actors was created and organized by actor Bela Lugosi, later known around the world for his 1931 portrayal of Dracula. It is that 95% of the actors' community has been more proletarian than the most exploited worker. After putting aside the glamorous trappings of his trade, at the end of each performance, an actor had, with few exceptions, to face worry and poverty. He was obliged either to bend himself to stultifying odd jobs to keep body and soul together, or he had to sponge off his friends get into debt, or prostitute his art. And he endured it, endured the poverty, the humiliation, the exploitation, just so that he could continue to be an actor, to get parts, for without them, he could not live. Actors were exploited no less by the private capitalist managers than they were by the state. The actor, subsisting on starvation wages and demoralized, was often driven, albeit reluctantly, to place himself at the disposal of the former ruling classes. Martyrdom was the price of enthusiasm for acting. A proletariat film academy, run by Dejo Urban, established a socialist film industry and produced well over 40 films, including the agitprop film Tenyap, or Yesterday. But perhaps one of the most effective methods of propaganda were the propaganda posters, brightly colored, easy to make, and incredibly efficient. During the 1919 Hungarian Soviet Republic, the poster functioned as the propaganda means par excellence. Its striking power of expression and exhortation involving red with figures in dramatic poses was recognized as being worth more than 1,000 words. Revolutionary placards were everywhere, on almost every wall of almost every street. The quantity is difficult to imagine today. A large proportion were in color, and red certainly dominated. Each had a clear message to convey, and pictorially was simply presented. As free as all this expression seemed, it appeared that the degenerate voice was heard loud and clear. But for the peasants and counter-revolutionaries and conservatives, they would find their voices censored by numerous publications. Hungarian writer Cécile Tormé said that Marxists such as Lukács kill literature in Hungary. Even the Minister of Education, Zsigmond Khumphy, calls Lukács' methods an absolute barrenness of our cultural life. Lukács defended his approach. The People's Commissar for Education and Culture is not going to officially support any kind of literature tied to a particular line or party. The Communist Cultural Program only makes a distinction between good and bad literature, and is not prepared to throw out Shakespeare or Goethe on account of their not being socialist authors, but neither is it prepared to let loose dilettantism in art under the pretext of socialism. The Communist Cultural Program stands for the highest and purest art reaching the proletariat and is not going to allow its taste to be corrupted by editorial poetry badly used for political purposes. Politics is only the means. Culture is the goal. By the time Lenin died in 1924, Stalin was in power and saw people like Lukács, Trotsky, and Jewish revolutionary Willy Münzenberg as Marxist revisionists who only wanted to promote their Jewish agenda. When Romania invaded in 1919, he fled Hungary. Later in 1923, Lukács met Jewish-German-Argentine Marxist Felix Weil. Weil was intrigued at Lukács' approach to cultural Marxism, which up until then had largely only been focused on politics and economics. Weil funded Lukács and helped create the Institute for Social Research, that later became the institutional home for the Frankfurt School. Today, this school is affiliated with New York City's Columbia University. Felix Weil had gotten much of his fortune from his father, Hermann Weil, who directly financed the Institute for Social Research. Hermann had once been an advisor to Kaiser Wilhelm II. The school developed a set of ideas based on Marx and Karl Korsch, a critique of society and culture known as critical theory, a theory that partly suggests that people in society are oppressed, not by the ruling class, as Karl Marx proposed, but by the Western culture and its institutions, and that Christianity is an obstacle to human liberation. The school obtained a new director, Max Horkheimer, German philosopher and textile magnate, who also had been born into a wealthy Jewish family, a common theme for so many who appeared to champion the working class. Horkheimer was drafted into World War I, but he avoided service on medical grounds. In many ways, Lukács can be credited as the father of woke culture, and Weil's inspiration for the Frankfurt School would lead to numerous ideals still being pushed today. The Frankfurt School promoted Theodor Adorno's authoritarian personality, which cast traditional gender roles as prejudice. It was Adorno who inspired modern leftists to accuse the right of fascism. Gender was referred to as merely a social construct. Another member of the Frankfurt School, German Jew Herbert Marcuse, who coined the phrase "make love, not war," published Eros and Civilization, a mixture of Marxist and Freudian theories which advocated for polymorphous perversity. This book later became a standard for the sexual revolution of the 1960s. Marcuse inspired a coalition of victimhood, whether it be blacks, gays, Jews, or women. The ideas of Marcuse paved the way for the hatred of all things establishment, an idea that would be adopted by the Black Panthers, SDS, and the Weather Underground, as well as the modern-day Occupy movement, Me Too, and Black Lives Matter. His 1965 book, Repressive Tolerance, inspired the leftist use of tolerance, racial or political. But the ideas of the Frankfurt School, or the Marxist school of thought in general, was anything but tolerant. To understand the current social climate, one only needs to understand the foundations of the Frankfurt School: the creation of racism offenses and hate speech laws, continual change to create confusion in school curricula, masturbation propaganda in schools combined with the homosexualization of children and their corruption by exposing them to child porn in the classroom, the systematic undermining of parental and teachers' authority, huge immigration to destroy national identity and foment future race wars, the systematic promotion of excessive drinking and recreational drugs, the systematic promotion of sexual deviance in society, an unreliable legal system with bias against the victims of crime, dependency on state benefits, control and dumbing down of the media, encouraging the breakdown of the family, an all-out attack on Christianity, and the emptying of churches. Many of these points were already laid out in the pages of the alleged forgery of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The ideals of the Protocols and the Frankfurt School were nearly the same. The Frankfurt School was dedicated to the destruction of Western society, engineering crisis, confusion, and infighting by placing a supposed victim against their supposed oppressor. Willy Munzenberg said of the Frankfurt School, "We must organize the intellectuals and use them to make Western civilization stink. Only then, after they have corrupted all its values and made life impossible, can we impose the dictatorship of the proletariat." The Frankfurt School would push its degeneracy and perversions on the world. But first, out of the wreckage of World War I, the Marxist and Freudian ideals of the Frankfurt School would live itself out through the Weimar Republic.
Berlin in the 30s, in the 20s, was the Sodom and Gomorrah of the day. They were the Las Vegas of the day. They were the Sodom and Gomorrah of the day. Homosexuality, pornography, all the bestiality, all the garbage of the world, that was the capital of the world. He outlawed it. You're no longer allowed, closed all the bars, all the gay clubs, all the production, which were all run by Jewish people, unfortunately. Second rule. What's the second rule? Second rule was, you're not allowed to charge interest. No more interest. Now you would think, why? What does he care about interest? Well, because all the people that had the money, that lent the money out, were Jews. He didn't like it. So he said no more interest. Why? Because of the high interest that the Jews charged people was so high, it ruined, it destroyed the economy in Germany. They destroyed, just like they destroyed Russia. A few years before that, through their communism over there, Jews destroyed Russia. Not Goyim. Jews destroyed. Communism is by Jews. Well, don't let anybody confuse you. You look at history, Karl Marx, all the other Reshaim, they're all Jews. Wicked, but nonetheless Jews. They destroyed Russia, and he wrote in chapter 2 of Mein Kampf, they destroyed Russia, now they're destroying Germany, that's why I have to destroy them. Now, this doesn't make he's right. The point is, that's actually real, true history.
The decay of moral values in all areas of life, the period of deepest German degradation, coincided exactly with the height of Jewish power in Germany. After the fall of the Roman Empire, much of Europe, particularly Germany, had stayed prosperous and united through the monarchy, which was far from perfect, but allowed for German people and culture to prosper. Industry, architecture, and Christianity thrived throughout Europe under leaders like Frederick the Great, Otto von Bismarck, Tsar Nicholas, and Kaiser Wilhelm. But by the end of the First World War, Germany suffered disaster after disaster. The Treaty of Versailles carved up massive amounts of German land and left nearly 7 million Germans to endure foreign occupation. A new government would arise out of the city of Weimar. With it, a new constitution authored by Jewish German liberal lithographer Hugo Preuss. Preuss was married to Else Liebermann, daughter of German physicist Karl Liebermann. She was also related to the Ashkenazi Impressionist artist Max Liebermann, who was studying in Weimar, as well as German Jewish historian Felix Liebermann. In February of 1919, Preuss became the Minister of the Interior of the new Weimar Republic. He was appointed by the head of the revolutionary government, Friedrich Ebert, the first president of Germany and follower of Karl Marx. Ebert was the first elected head of state and the first social democrat and first civilian from a proletariat background. Ebert was opposed to the Treaty of Versailles and wary of Bolshevism. The Republic of Weimar was often referred to as Judenrepublik or Jews' Republic, and for good reason. Like the Bolshevik and Hungarian revolutionary government, the administration was mostly comprised of Jews. Weimar German Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau, son of Emil Rathenau, a leading figure in the European electrical industry, after partnering with electrical engineer Werner von Siemens to create the General Electric Company, which later joined Telefunken, Daimler Chrysler, Bombardier, and Deutsche Aerospace, now part of Airbus. Emil was married to Matilda Rathenau, or Matilda Nachman, from a family with a long line of Jewish Kabbalist mystics, including Moses ben Nachman, or Nachmanides, who had argued for the Talmud during the Disputation of Barcelona in 1263. Like so many Jews, Walter Rathenau had been a journalist, but took over AEG after his father Emil died. The city had signed a deal for the electrification of the entire city to Rathenau's private company back in 1884, the first private-public partnership. Weimar finance minister Rudolf Hilferding, Marxist economist, born to a wealthy Jewish merchant, Emil Hilferding. Deputy chief of the Berlin criminal police, Bernhard Weiss. Wealthy Jewish liberal who investigated the murder of foreign minister Walter Rathenau. Weiss shut down the National Socialist Party in 1927 and had 500 of its members arrested. He was also called upon to restore order to the Reichstag building after National Socialists assaulted journalist Helmut Klotz, who was covering the famed Röhm scandal involving Ernst Röhm, leader of the National Socialist Party's paramilitary wing, outed as a homosexual despite the criminalization of homosexuality. Although Hitler defended Röhm, he was later murdered in a purge known as the Röhm Purge, the Night of the Long Knives, or Operation Hummingbird, when Hitler, Göring, and Himmler ordered a series of executions, including Röhm and his group, also known as the Brown Shirts. Weiss was a vocal opponent of National Socialist politician Joseph Goebbels and sued him over 40 times, often preventing Goebbels to speak at various gatherings. Reichstag member Eduard Bernstein, Marxist and son of reformist Jews, Bernstein often kept communication with the British socialist organization known as the Fabian Society. Jewry made up only 0.9% of the Reich's population, yet dominated the political and cultural landscape. 56% of notaries were Jews, 52% of doctors, nearly 3 times as many Jews in German business. Rathenau, Mamroth, Berliner, Hirsch, Seligman, Tietz, Wertheim, Katzellenbogen, Ersfeld, Friedlander Fuld, all top earners in German commerce. But it was and is media and politics in which this minority is an overwhelming majority. By 1932, the 2 major press companies involving newspaper and magazines were Jewish-owned. Georg Bernhard was editor-in-chief of the Vossische Zeitung, which was a mostly financial publication. He himself had come from a banking background, but like many Jews of the time, felt a passion for journalism. The judgment of public opinion is influenced through a few string pullers who, by using much money in various countries, have established a comprehensive press apparatus that lets their mouthpieces loudly say whatever they want said. His comrade, Willy Munzenberg. The lie is a weapon in class struggle. Amongst the Communist Reichstag, nearly 15% were Jews. Amongst the Social Democrat Party, 22%. Jewry would dominate the sciences, especially the mind sciences and sexual science. Art and music would now see a movement that the Bolsheviks had hoped to achieve, and early Jewish socialists like Leopold Sommermann and Ferdinand Lassalle had paved the way for. This new republic had high ideals, but little experience, and it would be the people of Germany who suffered food shortages, homelessness, and frequent left-wing rebellions. France would come to collect reparations in 1923 after Germany unsurprisingly defaulted on what was nearly $1 trillion payment by today's standards. France restructured the deal to $500 billion and accepted the rest in coal, steel, and other valuable resources, crippling Germany even more. Factories were shut down, businesses closed, fuel prices raised astronomically, and in January of 1923, by order of French Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré, the French 32nd Infantry Division marched across the eastern border into Germany, occupying the industrial valley of Ruhr. Apart from Belgium, the rest of the world was starting to see this as an act of spite, rather than reparation. The Treaty of Versailles was viewed by many the same way.
Mit vorgehaltener Pistole zu anderen gezogen, nachher in heuchlerischer Entrüstung sich über die einseitige Übertretung heiliger Gesetze und die Verletzung noch heiligerer Verträge zu beklagen. Denn wann ist jemals ein Volk niederträchtiger belogen und beschwindelt worden und betrogen worden, als in den zurückliegenden 2 Jahrzehnten? Das deutsche Volk durch die englischen Staatsmänner. Wo ist die versprochene Freiheit der Völker geblieben? Wo blieb damals die Gerechtigkeit? Wo blieb der Friede ohne Sieger und Besiegte? Wo blieb das Selbstbestimmungsrecht der Völker? Wo blieb der Verzicht auf Kontributionen, Kriegsentschädigungen und so weiter? Wo ist geblieben die Versicherung, dass eine allgemeine Abrüstung stattfinden würde? Lauter Lügen! Man hat uns unsere Kolonien genommen, man hat unseren Handel vernichtet, man hat unsere Kriegsflotte geraubt, man hat Millionen Deutsche von uns weggerissen, man hat sie misshandeln lassen, Man hat unser Volk ausgeplündert, man hat uns Kontributionen und Lasten aufgebürdet, die wir nicht in 100 Jahren hätten jemals abtragen können. Man hat uns in das tiefste Elend gestoßen. Und aus diesem Elend ist die nationalsozialistische Bewegung gekommen. Man soll heute nicht so tun, als ob man etwa einem Deutschland, das nicht nationalsozialistisch wäre, als ob man dem etwa das goldene britische Herz öffnen wollte. Das Deutschland, das wir einst kennenlernten, war, weiß Gott, alles andere als nationalsozialistisch. Das war demokratisch, das war weltbürgerlich, das glaubte blödsinnig auf Englisch, auf britische Versicherung, auf britische Staatsmänner. Dieses Deutschland hat damals Vertrauen gehabt, es hat sich selbst abgerüstet, es hat sich selbst entwehrt und es ist nur betrogen worden. Und aus der Not, die daraus kam, ist unsere Bewegung gekommen. Aus dem größten Wortbruch aller Zeiten ist ein Spar gekommen und wurde später in Versailles, den Schandvertrag, den Sie wissen, dass meine alten Kampfgenossen und ich gerade von dieser Stelle aus hier 100 und 100 und 100 Mal Ihnen dargelegt habe, Punkt für Punkt. Über 440 Artikel, in denen jeder Artikel teils eine Beleidigung, teils eine Vergewaltigung einer großen Nation ist und war. Die Folge davon war dann diese Zeit des Elends und der Verzweiflung. Darunter auch die Zeit der Inflation, des Raubs an allen Sparguthaben, des Raubs an allen Lebensmöglichkeiten, die Zeit der großen Erwerbslosigkeit, des langsamen Verhungerns unseres Volkes, die Zeit der ungeheuren Selbstmorde in Deutschland. Und immerhin hat dieses Deutschland damals in 2 Jahren mehr Selbstmorde bekommen, als Amerikaner im Lauf des Krieges im Westen gefallen sind.
The invasion was a spectacular failure on all fronts. It would last 3 years and never resulted in anything but long-term loss for France. What it would result in for Germany would be a rise of nationalism. Germans were already feeling a strong sense of resentment for the foreign Jews who they felt had brought them to this point. Poincaré was ousted immediately, but years later, the world would see his failure more as a failure to punish the Germans completely. But the reality was that Germany had more than enough, and only those who influenced the mass media felt otherwise. And thanks to their influence, the world would once again have their mind changed. The famous stab in the back legend was all centered around how far Germany had fallen since 1914. When Germany felt that they had rightfully won the war, but it was the Jews who had negotiated with Britain for America's entrance into the war, in exchange for Palestine. Now Germany had nearly collapsed. The new government would be dominated by foreign Jewish interests, almost directly coinciding with the Jewish international banking interests, with a constitution written by the Jew, and a government influenced by institutions such as the Frankfurt School, which was influencing the German youth. Lukács' idea of revolution and eros was simple: to use sexual instinct as an instrument of destruction. And in Weimar culture, we would see the result of this destruction. Berlin would devolve into the sin capital of the world. Drugs, sex, prostitution, pedophilia, and every low form of degeneracy would spill into the streets of Berlin. Prostitution was everywhere. Due to the financial situation for the average German citizen, many would turn to the world's oldest occupation as a means to survive. No perversion was denied. I saw pimps offering anything to anybody. Little boys, little girls, robust young men, libidinous women, animals. The story went the rounds that a male goose, whose neck you cut at just the right ecstatic moment, would give you the most delicious frisson of all, as it allowed you to enjoy sodomy, bestiality, homosexuality, necrophilia, and sadism at one stroke. Gastronomy, too, as one could eat the goose afterward. Berlin had their own institute, created by Ashkenazi Jewish physician Magnus Hirschfeld, the Institute of Sexual Research, which attempted to give an air of scholastic respectability to their depraved behavior. The Institute published titles such as Aphrodisiacs, Prostitution, Sexual Catastrophes, Sexual Pathology. The perverted many so-called research papers were often anonymous accounts of severe perversions, such as bestiality, necrophilia, and pedophilia. The vulgar parts were sometimes written in Latin, perhaps to make it appear more highbrow. Hirschfeld himself published The Homosexuality of Men and Women, light entertainment and cabaret review shows, which was largely a Jewish endeavor, left little to the imagination and often resulted in orgies and public masturbation. By 1931, over 60% of German films were produced by Jews, 82% of film scripts by Jewish writers, an astounding amount, especially considering that in 1931, the Jewish population in Germany was less than 1%. One only need to see some of the titles of the review shows, books, and films to see that the old-fashioned views of self-control had given way to lust and the desire to satisfy it. The German culture was being replaced with a new, foreign culture of loose morals and desire for debauchery. One would be hard-pressed to find any local writers or directors in this field. What you would see would be a heavy presence of a small, foreign minority. Writers like Yvonne Bloch, known as the first sexologist, influenced to Sigmund Freud, and the man who discovered Marquis de Sade's manuscript of 120 Days of Sodom, a pornographic novel about young libertines who engage in all forms of sexual depravity, abuse, torture, and murder. Ludwig Levi-Lenz, German doctor who performed some of the first sex reassignment surgeries for the Hirschfeld Institute. Erotic novelist Leo Skidrovitz, army surgeon, neuropathicist, and electrotherapist Albert Eulenberg, who became interested in sexology later in his career and authored a work on algolagnia, which is the sensation of sexual pleasure from physical pain. The perversions even flirted with sexual murder. During the years of 1925 to 1930, those urges would be acted out by the vampire of Dusseldorf, Peter Kürten, guilty of 9 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. Kürten had engaged in rape of his own daughter, numerous instances of torture and bestiality. Kürten was involved in sexual assault even in prison. He eventually confessed to his wife so that she could turn him in and collect his reward. Kürten's reasoning? To strike back at an oppressive society. In the end, he blamed the failed system from which he had become a product. He received 9 death sentences. His last words? "Tell me, after my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." The serial killer now became an icon for crime, and especially sex crime, which would be highlighted in film and literature. Child prostitution lined the streets of Berlin, as described by Sir Arthur Bryant in his 1940 work, Unfinished Victory. Most of them, the nightclubs and vice resorts, were owned and managed by Jews, and it was the Jew among the promoters of this trade who were remembered in after years. Children as young as 10 years old, mother-daughter teams, dominatrixes, all to be ordered by phone and serviced by taxi. With the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm, the iconic image of the stoic, masculine German evolved into a more feminine, psychosexual male. In conquered German regions, soldiers took up cross-dressing and other fetishes. Rape became commonplace, particularly in the countryside. The most immediate danger to the capital was venereal disease. An abundance of cocaine, morphine, opium, and of course the androgynous dancer Anita Berberer's mix of chloroform and ether all could be found, not just made available to aristocrats and socialites. Interracial, intergenerational, forced, and obsessive or abusive scenarios and relationships were in constant display. Whore bars, honky-tonks, and hourly hotels became the new form of entertainment. Fashion that blurred the line between masculine and feminine. radium creams and tinctures from yohimbe bark sold to arouse desire. Many of the seamstresses of the day were white Russians from the toppled Russian Empire, noble women turned working women who incorporated their style of flapper couture. While many of the Germans had lost everything following the Treaty of Versailles, charities such as Catholic Relief, the Red Cross, and the Salvation Army would move in to capitalize on the situation. Because of the severe inflation, many employees were paid by the day and had to hurry to deposit their money in the bank before the value of their salary could drop, sometimes by half. Paper scrips were issued at such a rate that the best value was often for kindling. The great inflation was briefly held off with the Weimar government introducing the Rentenmark, which helped to stabilize the economy overnight, and the Reichsmark came later in 1924 and would buy the administration a few more years. During May celebrations in Nuremberg, a whore queen was chosen in a competition open to all and given temporary jurisdiction over the municipality. Berlin nightlife? My word, the world hasn't seen anything like it. We used to have a first-class army. Now we have first-class perversions. The female image took on a strong-willed, independent tone that no longer needed the masculine male. Girl culture would define the mid-20s, as illustrated perfectly by American producer Florian Ziegfeld, producer of the famed New York Ziegfeld Follies. This kind of woman wasn't interested in finding a family, and was more sexual predator than partner. But these reversed role archetypes were nothing new then either. The same female-dominant sexual behavior that had led the biblical Israelites astray at Mount Sinai and again at Baal Peor were once again repackaged and sold to a war-weary Germany as liberating and progressive. Young men were also attracted to prostitution, offering themselves as wild boys, beaus, line boys, or doll boys. Before the Weimar Republic, Paris had been regarded as the hotspot, particularly for lesbian activity. But even many of these women migrated eastward and participated in Berlin's many social clubs, ice skating leagues, nudist retreats, sports associations, and even book clubs. I was told that some of those who looked most handsome and elegant were actually boys in disguise. It seemed incredible, considering the sovereign grace with which they displayed their saucy coats and hats. I wondered if they might be wearing little silks under their exquisite gowns. Must look kind of funny, I thought. A boy's body with a pink lace-trimmed shirt? Not very pleasant, though. Were there Russian princes among those picturesque, if somewhat revolting hermaphrodites? Or sons of Prussian generals who, in such a bizarre mode, protested against the rigid principles of their fathers? Hirschfeld is often referred to as the Einstein of sex, having founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee in 1897 and serving as president of the World League for Sexual Reform. But much of his studies have only retarded the scientific community. Even to this day, Hirschfeld's sexual relativity suggested that the notion of only two sexes was unscientific and that there were an infinite number of possibilities, an idea that is steadily promoted today, but not necessarily a new idea, and most certainly not new to Judaism. In Tractate Yevamot 79b of the Babylonian Talmud, the following genders are recognized: androgynous, Eilanit, Ish, Isha, Saris, Saris Kama, Saris Adam, and Tumtum, with emphasis on words like pronouns and scientific research. Young people are inclined to believe that these deranged perversions are actually rooted in science and logic, leading one to think that they are trusting in the science. But the Institute of Sexology was nothing but a destructive force of rakishness. Still, it managed to attract the attention of celebrities like Russian Jewish songwriter George Gershwin, German Jewish American actor Douglas Fairbanks, French Nobel Peace Prize winning author André Gide, Soviet Jewish film director Sergei Eisenstein, son of famed architect Mikhail Eisenstein, who had converted to Orthodox Christianity and worked for the Russian Tsarist White Russians. Son Sergei fought in the Red Army during the Bolshevik Revolution. The institute served as a hospital, university, and library, and gave regular lectures and provided a forum to educate lawyers on how to eradicate laws against homosexuality and abortions, which were also being committed at the university. It was Hirschfeld who coined the term transvestite. This institute of libertinism carried out pediatric care, abortions, sexual rejuvenation operations, psychological evaluations, and so-called gender reassignment surgeries, not to mention the multitude of medical documentaries and films produced by Hirschfeld himself. For all the decadence and celebration surrounding the Hirschfeld Institute, little was known about the funding of such a highly staffed and multifaceted operation. Rumors were that many closet gay German industrialists had kept the school going, including one pedophile who gave a vast amount of wealth in order to build a nursery, complete with sex objects shaped like toys. They also created and patented aphrodisiacs and anti-impotence tablets, like Testafortan. Some of these were even purchased by the Nazi and Allied force governments and later sold to Swiss pharmaceutical firms. Berlin in 1920 was in shambles. Economic chaos and political instability, mass unemployment, and food shortages created disillusionment on all political sides. A popular eugenicist by the name of Margaret Sanger arrived to see for herself after corresponding with her travel mate, Jewish Ukrainian anarchist Rose Whitcup, wife of British communist and anarchist Guy Aldrin, and member of the Jubilee Street Club in London. Sanger believed that the poverty was simply a result of overpopulation and commented on the lack of food. The women are the sufferers. The best food must be given to the men. Charities and kind societies give the children cocoa and soup, but the mother goes without or lives on what she can scrape together. Her life is a constant hunt for food. All her days are occupied with the problem of feeding her family. It is a terrible problem. Margaret was married to William Sanger, a Jewish architectural student from Berlin. Sanger had become popular for her founding of the American Birth Control League, which later became Planned Parenthood. She partnered with the Birth Control Federation of America to form the Negro Project, which delivered birth control and later abortions to Black Americans. Sanger had gotten much of her money from Julius Rosenwald, former CEO of Sears and Roebuck. Sanger believed that her mission was to legalize abortion, arguing, "The women say quite frankly in defending abortion that if it is right for the state to take a child and kill it in wars after it has been brought into the world, then it is equally just to assert the mother's right to prevent its coming here. This may sound cruel and inhuman to many of us in England and America who do not advocate abortions, but no one can refute its logic. It is a noteworthy fact that none of the women to whom I have spoken so far believes in abortion as a practice, but it is principle for which they are standing." The Social Democrat Party wanted only to allow for first trimester abortions, while the Independent Socialists wanted to legalize it outright. Both failed. Most of her German opposition came from doctors who believed that more children was the solution. Sanger then went to Munich, where she attended a Communist Party meeting, and later to Dresden in search for a contraceptive jelly. But many believed that her vague references to the chemist and the product may have simply been a distraction from her meetings with anarchists. She would eventually set up clinics in Berlin with the help of Agnes Smedley, American journalist, supporter of the Chinese Communist Revolution, and suspected spy for Comintern, who had been arrested by U.S. Naval Intelligence in 1918 for violations of the Espionage Act. She later developed a relationship with Soviet spy master Richard Sorge, codenamed Ramsey, considered one of the most accomplished spies ever, also arrested for espionage. Perhaps the concerns about Sanger's dealings were warranted. At a dinner speech for the Women's Economic Club in Philadelphia, Sanger suggested that rather than sending aid for starving children in Germany and other European countries, the United States should send over a quantity of chloroform to put them out of their misery, and that it would be the best thing for the children and for the future of the world. With the new discoveries of Tesla, Marconi, and Edison, and newly broadcast ideas on behavioral sciences by people such as Jung and Freud, occult sciences gained popularity once again, and Berlin played host to all sorts of mystics, seances, and healers. Babylonian sex magic was not just practiced in back rooms and cabarets, but in the science lab, in politics, and in the church. The German church struggled with paganism even amongst their Christian sects. As far back as the 13th century, Satanism had been practiced throughout the countryside of Germany during the years between 1500 and 1800. Over 15,000 women were executed for necromancy. Obscene parodies of Catholic and Lutheran services were carried out, involving the drinking of urine, psychedelics, semen, and menstrual blood. Even the priests were implicated. Numerous politicians were revealed to have extensive libraries of books on the black arts and summoning demons. I saw a woman turn like a tigress and sink her teeth deep into the shoulder of a man who leaped in front of her. He tore her hair until he broke the grip of her teeth and screamed. He began kissing her brutally. I saw others cutting each other with knives, and a man dragging a woman by her hair and striking her naked shoulders with a whip until they were streaked with blood. And finally, as the culminating horror, I saw a nude woman with a dagger leap upon the huge, now completely terrified goat and cut its throat from ear to ear, so that the blood gushed out in a stream, while men and women fought and clawed and tore at each other to bathe in the blood. The mad orgy lasted until dawn. Another product of this occult influence in Berlin was ballet dancer Rudolf von Laban, founder of Expressionist dance, son of a military governor, and founder of the Johannes Lodge of ancient Freemasons of the Scottish and Memphis and Mizram rites in the Valley of Zurich. He would often be featured dancing within the Metatron Cube. He had been exposed to Freemasonry by Anglo-German communist and occultist Theodor Reuss. Reuss was a spy for the Prussian secret police and was expelled from England, where he traveled extensively. Reuss had tried to revive Adam Weishaupt's Bavarian Illuminati shortly after his friends from the Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn produced a charter for the Swedenborgian Rite of Masonry. Dr. Ernst Skurtel and his drama theater, which was more like a macabre science fiction review involving various fetishes. One of his clients, an 11-year-old girl. Skurtel hypnotized his dancers and encouraged them to move freely, an act that failed to capture the imagination of the audience.
Hält sie ja überall im Land. Was halten Sie von denen?
Naja, die meisten davon sind Hochstapler. Hat es immer gegeben, wird es immer geben. Insbesondere in einer Zeit, in der die Menschen eine übersteigerte Hilfe brauchen.
Wissen Sie alles im Voraus?
Wie ein Komponist Töne hört, spüre ich Kräfte, die aus Gedanken, Instinkten zusammengesetzt sind, Wünschen, Sehnsüchten und die direkt zu mir überströmen.
Als Hellseher werden Sie doch bestimmt wissen, wer im Januar Reichskanzler wird.
Wissen Sie es oder wissen Sie es nicht?
In dieses Spiel mische ich mich nicht ein.
Also wissen Sie es nicht.
Ich habe mehrmals erklärt. Parteikämpfe, kein Kommentar.
Sie wagen nichts zu sagen, weil Sie befürchten, dass sich herausstellen wird, dass Sie sich geirrt haben.
Wie Sie alle wissen, irre ich mich nie.
Dann sagen Sie es doch.
Es geht nicht.
Sind Sie feige?
Ich bin Österreicher, ich bin Gast in diesem Land.
Nicht der Einzige.
Sie haben überhaupt keine Ahnung. Wieso geben Sie das nicht zu?
Weil ich es weiß.
Sie hätten, wenn Sie was darüber wüssten, doch bestimmt längst was gesagt.
Reichskanzler wird Adolf Hitler.
Herschel Chaim Steinschneider, otherwise known as Erich Jan Hannussen, was perhaps the most well-known clairvoyant of his time. Hannussen claimed to be of Danish descent, but he was a Moravian Jew, son of actor Siegfried Steinschneider. Hannussen traveled extensively with his performer parents. To the communists, he was known as the People's Stupefier, a conjurer, hypnotist, magician, after he had been caught deceiving the public during a strongman exhibition. Hannussen claimed that he could hypnotize a woman, Marta Farah, to perform the same feats of strength as strongman Zishy Breitbart. After a few performances, a suspicious Breitbart hired an engineer who threw a party for Hannussen's stagehands and locked them in during a crucial point in the show where Breitbart's heavy chains and weights were exchanged for props. Hannussen was briefly banned from performing but continued on. he was arrested in Czechoslovakia on charges of seducing local housewives and talk of being a time traveler. During this trial, he met Dr. Leopold Thoma, who worked as a psychic for the Vienna police. Hannison and Thoma ran a number of occult sex schemes and moved to Berlin, where they conducted seances and sold sex creams. Drugs and orgies were a normal occurrence on Hannison's yacht. On March 25, 1932, Hannison claimed in his occult tabloid, Hannison Zeitung, that Adolf Hitler would be the one to lead as Reichschancellor, shocking many. Members of the National Socialist Party began to frequent Hannison's events, assuming his Danish origin. The bisexual libertine Count Wolf von Helldorf introduced Hannison to Hitler, and once again, he proclaimed that the Führer would lead Germany. Just a few weeks after that, Hannison held a grand seance where he gave another outlandish prediction that the Reichstag would be consumed by a divine fire. Only 20 hours later, he would be proven right again. This would also lead to his assassination on the 25th of March, 1933. Some believe he had improperly leaked sensitive information. Others believed that high-level members of Hitler's party were removing him out of jealousy. Still other rumors that he had been involved with the Reichstag fire itself, an arson attack on German parliament resulting in mass arrests of communists. As for Thoma, he quietly left for London, where he befriended the head of the Ordo Templi Orientis secret society, Aleister Crowley. The most prolific, visible, and controversial groups to arise during the interwar periods was the Fraternitas Saturni, a German magical order and creation of Eugen Grosch, Thelemic in nature, referring to Aleister Crowley's Thelemic pantheon, and concepts coming largely from Egyptian mysticism, Babylonian, and Jewish mystical Kabbalah. Egregor was the entity who harnesses the thought of the brotherhood, egregor coming from the Greek egregor, meaning the watcher, a supernatural son of God, or Saturn, Satan. The brotherhood, like many other organizations, would collapse during the Great Depression. The Weimar period saw a rise in a disturbing trend of Lustmord, the act of torturing or violating the victim to death. Many instances occurred simply by accident, from rough sexual play amongst consenting partners, although trickery and deceit could often lead to the victim discovering their fate at the last moment. Mutilation, annihilation, strangling, poisoning, dismemberment. For a brief period, antisocial behavior over the desire for money had become the primary motive for many of Berlin's murders. Two such cases were Fritz Haarmann, the werewolf of Hanover, who murdered at least 24 boys and young men between 1918 and 24, and the aforementioned Peter Kürten. Both of these characters have been perversely romanticized in folklore, and Kürten had been studied by Hirschfeld himself. But the Weimar era was showing the signs of instability and vulnerability. Political scandal had been an issue with this fledgling government. 1924, two Polish Jewish business owners, Julius and Henri Barmat, were granted permanent visas by President Frederick Ebert and had, by way of the National Postal Department, secured government investment in their businesses through bribes. These businesses then failed, and the government suffered huge losses. Chancellor Gustav Bauer was forced to resign. A few years later, three Jewish brothers of the name Sklarek had purchased a clothing company that outfitted agents of the municipality. False invoices for goods not delivered were soon discovered, and the fraud damage had reached 10 million marks. The brothers bribed numerous Weimar officials to cover it up, while much of the press claimed that this was simply another anti-Semitic attack. The corruption had been so deep that the court proceedings were 2,300 pages long. This became a turning point for the National Socialists, who had enough. Billy Sklarek died in Prague. Leo Sklarek was shot in a concentration camp. Max Sklarek murdered in Auschwitz. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Reichschancellor. February 27th, the Reichstag building was destroyed by arson. In the blink of an eye, emergency powers were transferred to Hitler to prevent a Marxist uprising. The Weimar era was officially over, an era that history often does not teach unless lauding the achievements of Einstein, Freud, or Hirschfeld. But it was the dissoluteness of this era one dominated and imposed upon Germans from the very foreign entity that walked them back into a war they had already won. This next era would become one the world would never forget or understand. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in Austria. His father Alois was an illegitimate child who had taken his mother's name of Schicklgruber until 1876, when Alois convinced the Austrian government to change his name by recognizing his deceased stepfather, Johann Hitler, as his biological father. Alois had hired a young Clara Pausel as a servant and began a relationship with her while still married to his second wife. After she died, Clara became pregnant with Adolf, prompting Alois to marry her. Adolf left school without finishing secondary education and eventually went to Vienna in hopes of studying art. He grew to dislike the multinational cosmopolitan scene and soon left for Munich. In early 1914, he was screened and deemed unfit for military service, but as World War I began, he was permitted to join the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment. Soon after, Hitler saw fighting in the First Battle of Ypres. He was wounded in 1916 and endured multiple mustard gas attacks. Due to his mustache being so long, Adolf was unable to seal his mask, leading him to cut the sides, resulting in his iconic mustache. His efforts earned him the Iron Cross Second Class in 1914 and the Iron Cross First Class in 1918. After the war, a disillusioned Adolf Hitler dedicated himself to politics and joined the German Workers' Party. Like many soldiers, Hitler was frustrated with the result of a winnable war that he had fought so hard for and the humiliating terms of the Versailles Treaty. His ambition would set him apart from the rest. Utilizing his charisma through the propaganda department of the Völkische Beobachter. Soon Hitler would be surrounded with the like-minded Eckart, Alfred Rosenberg, Rudolf Hess, Hermann Göring, and Julius Streicher. In November 1923, Hitler and General Erich Ludendorff attempted to force a revolution at the Munich Beer Hall Putsch, resulting in a battle between the army and the police. Hitler was injured and 4 policemen killed. He was placed on trial for treason and sentenced to 5 years in prison, only serving 9 months at Landsberg Castle, where he wrote the first volume of Mein Kampf. He believed the Weimar government failed to serve the people and that without this, there was no morality or truth. Hitler felt that Marxism, and not simply democracy, was the ultimate adversary, and that the Jews were the executors of this idea, calling them destroyers of culture, a parasite within a nation. But many historians and universities fail to note that most Karaite Jews, or adherents to Torah, were not persecuted. Many Jews even claim that Hitler viewed them as non-Jews, and yet Orthodox Judaism was never a target of Adolf Hitler.
Der Völkerstreit oder Hass untereinander, wird gepflegt von ganz bestimmten Interessenten. Es ist eine kleine, wurzellose, internationale Clique, die die Völker gegeneinander hetzt, die nicht will, dass sie zur Ruhe kommen. Es sind das die Menschen, die überall und nirgends zu Hause sind, die nirgends einen Boden haben, auf dem sie gewachsen sind, sondern die heute in Berlin leben, morgen genauso gut in Brüssel sein können, übermorgen in Paris oder mit in Prag oder in Wien oder in London und die sich überall zu Hause fühlen. Es sind die einzigen, die wirklich als internationale Elemente anzusprechen sind, weil sie überall ihre Geschäfte betätigen können. Aber das Volk kann ihnen ja nicht nachfolgen. Das Volk ist ja gekettet an seinen Boden, ist ja gekettet an seine Heimat, ist ja gebunden an die Lebensmöglichkeiten seines Staates, der Nation.
The party grew slowly but steadily, and by the Great Depression, and with the help of industrialist Alfred Hugenberg, Hitler would gain national attention, making the party now second largest in the nation. In 1932, Hitler opposed Hindenburg in the presidential election and by 1933, Hindenburg offered Adolf Hitler the chancellorship of Germany. After the events of the Reichstag fire, the National Socialist Party invoked Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, suspending civil liberties during national emergencies. Property rights, freedom of press and assembly, all suspended. Unlawful searches and seizures committed as well. Under the Enabling Act, this would require 31 votes from outside of the party, but the centrists would provide it. 440 votes registered, only 84 opposed. The Enabling Act gave Hitler the power he would require to command the armed forces. Years later, the Enabling Act would be discussed in regard to its distinct similarities to the Patriot Act in the USA during the Bush administration. A massive reach of power, and like the Reichstag fire, the Patriot Act came immediately after the events of 9/11. These unlawful perversions of the Constitution have been largely unreported, as most of the attention has been spent on the tragedy and lives lost. Discussion of these events were dismissed as unpatriotic, conspiracy theory, or simply untimely. As a new National Socialist Party and agenda would take shape under Hitler, nationalist ideals and resentment towards Jews grew through film and propaganda. The Frankfurt School moved to Geneva, then later to New York City, joining Columbia University, Berkeley, Princeton, and Brandeis. Today's Institute of Social Research promotes books by Weatherman Underground founder and terrorist Bill Ayers, Angela Davis, and many other various titles dealing with social justice, multiculturalism, and gender studies. The Jews responded. Boycotts and mass demonstrations calling for action in Europe and America. The war to end all wars had set the stage for yet another World War.